Hey guys, tonight we begin a story wrapped in velvet, stitched with gold, but stuffed with whispers and shadows. You find yourself drifting down a candlelit hallway of an old palace, one of those places where the air always smells faintly of old paper and faded perfume. Tapestries line the walls, too ornate to be innocent, and in every corner, under every silk-covered cushion, behind every heavy oak door, you can almost hear the murmur of secrets not meant to last this long. The truth is, royal families across time and continent have presented the world with an image of perfection, stoic portraits, carefully arranged marriages, polite smiles from balconies. But behind that public poise, there were locked chambers, hushed scandals, vanishing heirs, and letters that burned in fireplaces before anyone could read them aloud. And maybe, just maybe, the story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Let me know where and when you started watching this, or what detail left you wondering the most. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You pass through that corridor, and on the far end is a door slightly ajar, light spilling out in a warm, suspicious glow. That's where we begin. A private room, part study, part prison, where a king once sat bent over parchment, not with laws or treaties, but a personal confession. He was trying to explain a love that never made it into the history books. You settle into the shadows just as he dips his quill. That king? Well, you're not sure which one yet. That's part of the magic. There were so many monarchs hiding so many truths that you begin to wonder if honesty ever made it onto a throne at all. A mainstream historical fact. Most royal courts employed secret keepers, actual appointed roles to monitor gossip, manage blackmail, and keep reputations intact. They weren't always successful. You glide down a different hallway now, through a French chateau where a queen kept a secret bedroom behind a mirror. She didn't trust her ladies-in-waiting, not all of them, at least. She'd sneak there to meet with her personal herbalist, who brewed tonic said to calm the nerves, or to mask something far more delicate. Historians still argue whether these secret rooms were meant for safety, privacy, or discreet trysts, but nearly every palace blueprint from the 17th century has one. In another time, a Spanish infanta left court for a lengthy retreat due to nervous exhaustion. In truth, she had given birth. No father named, no baby recorded. The line of succession quietly rearranged itself, and no one spoke of it again. But the whispers still live in the walls. You pause, wondering how many royal lines carry hidden branches, unknown names that were never meant to bloom. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In Victorian England, a royal gardener was once suspected of blackmail after it was discovered he had been passing letters between a prince and a widowed actress. The gardener later claimed he just liked the paper quality. Sure he did. Now you glide toward the Russian winter, thick snow crunching under delicate boots. Inside the grand halls of the Romanovs, one particular Tsarina was said to whisper to paintings when no one was watching. Some say she spoke to her lost children. Others believe she had visions from opium-laced tea. The portraits she spoke to? Each one had a hidden panel behind it. What was kept inside? Letters? Mostly. One included a confession to a murder that never made it to trial. Historians still argue if the confession was real or a fever dream, scribbled by a woman on the brink. You press onward through cold corridors, now warmed by gas lamps and thick wool carpets. This time, the setting is London. Buckingham, perhaps? A servant's passage leads to a room with red walls and high windows. A diary was once hidden here, beneath a loose floorboard. In it, a lady-in-waiting wrote of nightly visits from a royal figure who feared sunlight, but not sin. The implication? Not quite scandalous enough to print, but just enough to bury. And it's always the burial that's fascinating, isn't it? Not the sin, the effort to erase it. Because royal families didn't need to erase all truth, only enough to preserve the crown. The rest? A wink, a nod, a burned document, a mysteriously missing page in an official ledger. You remember, don't you, that the Tudors had a knack for this? They'd rebrand enemies as traitors, rewrite birth records, even have painters subtly adjust the curl of a lip or the size of a child in a portrait to suggest legitimacy. Royal PR before social media was just oil paint and a well-timed rumour. You pause before another locked chamber, and this one feels different. No opulence, no perfume, just a stark chair, a narrow desk, and 3 sealed letters tied with silk cord. Their wax seals bear different crests. France, Austria, Prussia, none were ever delivered, because they weren't meant to be. They were written to keep their writers sane, not to be read. You bend closer to one letter and read the trembling lines aloud. They call it duty. I call it prison. A voice in the dark, and a truth that could have crumbled entire dynasties had it been known in its time. So you keep walking. You've only just started. And already, you're beginning to realise that every hallway of every royal palace is less a place of power, and more a maze of secrets, some buried deep, others hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone, like you, to gently peel back the velvet and see what lies beneath. You step lightly down a spiral staircase now, worn smooth by generations of quiet footsteps, many of them belonging to people who weren't supposed to exist. At the bottom of the steps, a narrow door opens to a small nursery. Faded wallpaper peels back from stone walls. A toy horse, one wheel broken, rests beside an empty cradle. You breathe in the stillness, and it settles like dust on your chest. This room once belonged to a child the world never knew. Tonight, you're walking among the hidden heirs, the sons and daughters born of royal blood, but born into silence. Their names erased from records, their lives redirected or extinguished, their stories only whispered behind closed doors. Mainstream fact: illegitimate royal children weren't rare. They were routine. Kings, princes, and occasionally even queens had children outside of official marriage. And while some were acknowledged and given titles, many more were quietly spirited away to convents, foreign courts, or countryside estates. Entire lineages disappeared this way, because a royal surname was only valuable if it was clean. You move toward a desk, its drawers still faintly scented with lavender and cedar. Inside, a baptismal certificate, unsigned. The ink has faded, but the name was once royal. A fringe tidbit whispers itself to you. One 18th century Habsburg prince was rumoured to have fathered a child with his sister's governess. The child lived in the palace for 5 years before being adopted by a distant cousin. Scholars still argue whether that child grew up to be the mysterious count who suddenly rose to prominence decades later in the Austrian military. You glance at the cradle again and wonder how many nobles called themselves cousins to people who were really brothers, sons, or even fathers. It makes you tilt your head and smile, dryly. Family trees, more like bramble bushes. You climb out of the nursery and into a sunroom where a painted ceiling hides a trapdoor. When you open it, you find a staircase leading down, again. Royal secrets, it seems, are often buried deeper than the basements. You descend slowly and enter a wine cellar, but the barrels are long gone. In their place, ledgers, boxes, sealed parchments. Evidence. One folder catches your eye. It's tied with red ribbon. Inside, notes detailing monthly payments to a seamstress in Versailles. They span nearly 15 years. There's no work attached. But there's a name that matches court gossip. Whispers of a girl who bore a royal child and vanished the same week. Some claim she moved to the countryside. Others say she was paid to disappear. And maybe both are true. Historians still argue whether kings truly loved these hidden children or if they were merely complications to manage. Letters exist, soft, sentimental ones, from monarchs to their secret offspring filled with affection and longing. But so do others, crisp, curt, written by advisors who paid off wet nurses and tutors to maintain the illusion of absence. Now you're walking through a long gallery filled with portraits. At first glance, they're the usual stoic figures with sceptres and stiff collars. But look closer. Some subjects bear resemblance to known kings, same jawline, same sad eyes, but the captions simply say nobleman or court official. These could be hidden heirs, granted painting sessions but denied titles. One woman's likeness holds a child whose face is turned just enough away to be unrecognisable. You can't help but murmur, "Who are you really?" A joke bubbles up. Royal DNA tests would break the internet. But then again, maybe they already have. Rumours always swirl, after all, of modern-day people discovering surprising ancestry through mail-order kits. Some whispers suggest Buckingham and Versailles both have quiet agreements with certain genealogy firms. But that's probably just pillow talk. Still, one can't help but wonder. If walls could talk, how many children would they remember rocking to sleep? How many wet nurses sworn to silence? How many tutors instructed to teach Latin and fencing, but only after dark, when no one would see? Now you enter a chapel. Its stained glass glows like melted jewels, and you pause in the hush. Here, one child was baptised at midnight under a false name, with only 2 witnesses. They say she grew up as a lady's maid and later married a baker. But the locket she wore to her grave bore the royal crest. A tiny defiance, or perhaps a secret proudly kept. You kneel beside the altar and trace your fingers along a groove in the stone floor. Hidden there, a name scratched lightly. Anne, no last name, just Anne. And you wonder, was she born from a fleeting moment of affection, or from duty abandoned? Was she loved, or merely tolerated? Perhaps both. You stand, heart beating in rhythm with the hush. This chapel saw joy, sorrow, and deception alike. And in that mix, like everywhere else in royal history, truth was only as powerful as the silence around it. A breeze stirs from the back of the chapel, drawing you down a final hallway lit by flickering torches. On its walls are letters, maps, and torn sketches of infants with royal features and uncertain destinies, each face half remembered, each name half lost. And you realise, history isn't just written by the victors, it's also carefully edited by the powerful. And few are more powerful, or more practised in secrecy, than royalty. As you walk through the last of this gallery, the silence settles in again. Heirs unclaimed. Children hidden. Lives erased not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of disarray. Fear that if one secret surfaced, 1,000 more might follow. And maybe they will, but not tonight. You slip through a narrow, velvet-draped corridor where the air smells faintly of roses and something darker. Perhaps crushed laurel leaves or old iron. You arrive at a dining room not meant for feasting. Its long table gleams, but not with silverware. Here, beneath crystal chandeliers and portraits with watchful eyes, secrets were served not on plates, but in goblets and tiny glass vials. Tonight, you're brushing up against the whispered world of royal poisoning, delicate, deadly, and often delivered with a smile. Your fingers hover over a tarnished goblet etched with curling vines. It looks innocent, but a trained eye might spot the faint interior residue, the ghost of a substance that once altered history. A mainstream historical fact. During the Italian Renaissance, poison was considered an art form. The infamous Borgia family, yes, the very one that inspired countless novels and Netflix plotlines, was suspected of using la cantarella. a slow-acting poison allegedly slipped into wine. Historians still argue whether Cantarella was a specific compound or simply a myth crafted by their enemies to explain convenient deaths. Either way, the reputation stuck. You raise an empty cup and imagine a king's advisor lifting it during a toast, the rim just barely kissed with venom. Do you drink? Do you hesitate? Or do you feign a sip and hope your enemy is watching? Now, a joke tickles your brain. Trust issues, royal edition, when you test your wine on a court jester first. But jesters, in truth, weren't the only tasters. Many courts are dedicated food testers, low-ranking nobles, sometimes even monks, tasked with eating a portion of every dish before the royal dared take a bite. Imagine dinner with a side of suspense. Your steps echo down to a smaller room, a chemist's nook, tucked beside the kitchens. Glass bottles line the shelves, each labelled in elegant calligraphy, belladonna, arsenic, mercury, hemlock. Some were medicinal in small doses, others absolutely not. Fringe tidbit. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was rumoured to carry her own supply of poison and test new recipes on prisoners before inviting guests to her salons. Whether she did or didn't, the rumours were potent enough to make guests think twice before accepting tea. In a locked drawer, you discover a courtier's personal recipe journal, part medical text, part murder manual. Beside a remedy for indigestion is a blend called Sleeping Cordial, which includes poppy extract, powdered toad skin, and a measure of quicksilver. That last one, of course, is mercury, and it may explain why one 16th century nobleman was said to sleep forever after taking a single spoonful. Historians still argue if such concoctions were truly meant for health, or if they were the polite disguises for slow-motion assassinations. You glide now through the Russian winter once more, snow dusting your shoulders like sugar. Within the high walls of the Romanov palace, a whisper circles. The Empress's tea tasted off the night before her collapse. An apothecary was arrested, then released, then disappeared. His notes were never found, but his name reappeared months later in a coded letter, half burned, found in a noblewoman's drawer. There are other stories, like the Habsburg cousin who insisted on travelling with his own portable kitchen, or the English baron who ate only eggs for weeks, cracking them open himself, terrified of ground glass. A light joke rises. Nothing says brunch like existential dread. But truly, fear ruled the menu in many royal courts. Every meal was an act of trust, or a gamble. You reach a locked cabinet and pry it open. Inside, a velvet pouch holds 3 rings, their stones dulled by time. But look closely. One has a hinge. It opens to reveal a tiny chamber, a poison ring, used to store a pinch of toxin that could be slipped into a drink or taken quickly in case of capture. These weren't just fiction. Real examples exist in museums today, though some scholars debate how often they were truly used versus symbolised danger and status. And then there's the tragic comedy of errors. One emperor was rumoured to have been accidentally poisoned by his own cook, who mistook a satchel of ground arsenic for baking flour. The pastries were beautiful. The funeral was swift, but records are murky, and it's possible the story was just a cover-up for something darker. Or perhaps a terrible joke that got out of hand. Death by cake doesn't exactly inspire a solemn legacy. Back in France, imagine the polished salons of Versailles, where royal women wore perfume laced with tiny traces of belladonna to dilate their pupils. It made their eyes look dreamy, ethereal, but prolonged exposure could lead to blurred vision, dizziness, and fainting spells. How many courtly collapses were labelled hysteria, when in truth they were chemically induced? How many deaths chalked up to weak nerves were simply belladonna in disguise? You pause in a corridor where a tapestry hangs slightly crooked. Behind it, a small niche, barely wider than a loaf of bread. Inside, a porcelain teacup and a gold spoon, both stained black where silver once touched arsenic. A final trace. A silent warning. You wonder whose lips were the last to touch them. And as your thoughts wander, you realise something chilling. The more opulent the court, the deadlier the danger. Gilded plates, perfumed halls, and whisper-thin veils of trust, all masking power games where the deadliest weapon came not with a sword but with a sip. You step back into the Hall of Mirrors, your reflection fractured into 100 copies of yourself. One raises a glass, one hesitates. One disappears entirely. Not all poisons kill quickly. Some take their time, just like secrets. You move from the Hall of Mirrors into a soft-lit drawing room where the air hums with perfume. Silk rustles faintly, and every glance carries the weight of a question never asked aloud. You've entered the domain of royal bedrooms, not just for rest, but for strategy, betrayal, and quiet diplomacy. This is the world of bedroom diplomacy, where affairs didn't just shape hearts, they shaped empires. You trail your fingers along the back of a velvet chaise where, centuries ago, a king whispered promises to a duchess whose husband was conveniently away at war. A mainstream historical fact. In 18th century France, Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of King Louis XV, held more political influence than many ministers. She arranged treaties, decided cultural policies, and even handpicked the king's future mistresses after their romance turned platonic. Historians still argue whether her real power came from love, intelligence, or the king's fear of being alone. Now you step into a grand chamber with drapes pulled shut against the night. The bed is massive. Its posts carved with scenes of battles and weddings, as if it knew it would witness both. In royal courts, marriages were about alliances. But the true connections, the ones whispered behind closed doors and scribbled in hurried letters, happened outside official unions. You pause at a writing desk scattered with love notes. One reads, "Your absence makes the crown heavier." It's unsigned, but the handwriting matches a queen known for her icy public demeanour. Love here was often silent, or scandalous. A light joke drifts in your mind. Married for land, but in love with the gardener. And you realise this wasn't far off. Kings and queens often married out of duty, then found affection where the heart wandered. And when those hearts wandered, so did politics. In the corridors of Elizabethan England, you overhear whispers about Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. His close and very frequent visits to Queen Elizabeth thus raised eyebrows across Europe. She never married, but their connection was undeniable. Historians still argue whether they were lovers, close confidants, or both. The Queen remained the Virgin Queen publicly, but behind closed doors, the curtains were thick, and the truth may never fully escape them. You glide toward the Austrian Empire now, where Empress Maria Theresa carefully arranged her children's marriages like chess pieces across Europe. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, would become Queen of France, her bedroom becoming a political fault line between Austria and Bourbon France. And yet, for nearly 7 years, that royal marriage went unconsummated. A fringe tidbit. Doctors were consulted, letters exchanged, and even a surgical solution was proposed, all because their union held diplomatic consequences beyond the sheets. Now imagine the pressure, being told that the peace of 2 kingdoms depends on your ability to produce an heir. You stare at a royal cradle in a candlelit nursery and wonder how many children were born not out of love, but as peace treaties with tiny hands. You step into a quieter room now, smaller, but no less dangerous. It belonged to a lesser-known duchess, rumoured to be the mother of a king's secret second son. The child was raised in the countryside, officially labelled as a noble ward. His resemblance to the monarch? Unmistakable. Historians still argue whether he was quietly included in succession plans, should the legitimate heir fall ill, or if he was simply a backup no one ever admitted existed. You lean into a closet, where behind a row of brocade gowns hangs a hidden doorway. It leads to a narrow passage between rooms, one of many built into palaces to allow discreet visits. One servant claimed he saw a prince walk that hall nearly every night for 3 years, to visit a woman whose name never made it into any official biography. But he also claimed he once saw her speaking to the paintings. So, grain of salt. Joking aside, you begin to understand, in royal courts, bedrooms weren't private, they were strategic battlegrounds. Lovers could be spies. Mistresses could influence entire wars. Children could seal alliances or spark feuds. A misplaced glance at a masked ball might start a decade-long affair. Or a war. Now you find yourself in Versailles again. The perfume strong and the air too warm. One noblewoman keeps a ledger not of finances, but of romantic entanglements. She ranks each liaison by discretion, charm, and political usefulness. It's a casual game for her, but the results sway appointments and punishments. A courtier's downfall, it seems, can begin with a misplaced kiss. Here's a peculiar tidbit. In 17th century Sweden, a law was briefly considered to officially recognise royally encouraged companionships as politically significant arrangements. It was shelved, likely because no one could agree on what counted as encouraged and what was just convenient passion. You pause by a canopy bed where 4 silhouettes once met in secret. A queen, her brother-in-law, a spy posing as a servant, and an exiled poet. The poet kept a diary. What survived of it suggests their alliance shifted an entire war effort, though some say he just wanted to be near the Queen's perfume. And isn't that the puzzle? Romance and politics were never truly separate in these gilded halls. A soft sigh could echo louder than a sword. A single letter could undo a dynasty. A lover scorned could become a traitor overnight. You lean against the bedpost and feel the history pulsing through the wood. How many nights held their breath in this very room? How many secrets linger in the sheets, never to be washed away? Royal bedrooms, places of velvet, betrayal, and diplomacy wrapped in silken sheets. A touch of love, a touch of danger, and always, always, a thread connecting heartbeats to history. You find yourself walking through the quiet corridors of a summer palace, its windows wide open to the soft evening air. But something about the silence inside feels off, too still, too careful, as if the place itself is holding its breath. You step into a grand salon and see a portrait of a king, handsome, proud, dressed in velvet and gold, but the eyes don't match the smile. They're hollow, maybe frightened, or lost. Tonight, you walk among kings and queens whose minds unravel behind crowns and curtains. This is the secret history of royal madness, those tortured souls who ruled nations while their own realities slipped from view. A mainstream historical fact: King George III of Britain famously suffered from bouts of mental illness, now believed to have been either bipolar disorder or the result of a rare blood disease called porphyria. He spoke non-stop for hours, foamed at the mouth, and once shook hands with a tree because he thought it was the King of Prussia. His condition was kept hidden for years until it could no longer be denied, and a regency had to be established. Historians still argue whether his illness was used as a political excuse by those eager to reduce his power. You step into his private chamber now, plain, almost painfully so, stripped of luxury. The mirrors are covered. The bed linens are white. There's no gold, no crest, just a padded chair in the corner, worn smooth from restless nights. A nearby attendant once wrote in a letter that His Majesty spoke to the angels again last night. The letter was burned the next day. You moved to Austria, where Empress Elizabeth, Sisi to those who adored her, walked obsessively every day for miles, kept her rooms in near darkness, and developed such a rigid diet and beauty regimen that it bordered on self-erasure. She wore black after her son's tragic death and rarely smiled in public again. Some call it grief, others whisper madness. A fringe tidbit suggests she believed she could communicate with the dead through her hairbrush, though this was never confirmed in any official account. In a dim bedroom tucked beneath a Bavarian fortress, you find a writing desk covered in poetry, lines repeating themselves, circling like birds in a storm. This was Ludwig II's room, the so-called Mad King of Bavaria, who built fairy tale castles and bankrupted his treasury doing so. Historians still argue if he was truly insane or simply too romantic for his political climate. He was eventually declared unfit to rule without ever being examined in person, and was found dead in a lake days later under suspicious circumstances. A diagnosis, it seems, was as dangerous as a dagger. Here comes a soft laugh in the back of your mind. When your therapist is also your political rival, what could go wrong? Now you walk through the hushed halls of the Spanish Habsburgs. So many portraits, all with the same long jaw, the same heavy eyelids, the same sadness. Generations of inbreeding, marriages between uncles and nieces, left some royal offspring cognitively impaired, physically fragile, or emotionally unstable. Charles II of Spain, the last of the line, could barely speak, drooled as an adult, and believed witches had cursed him. His court kept his condition secret for as long as possible. When he died childless, the empire fractured. A soft wind blows through the hall, and you pause beside a case containing a velvet diary, its pages worn thin. The entries are fragmented, like a puzzle without edge pieces. They were written by a young princess locked away in a tower under medical supervision, her sin, speaking in riddles and refusing to eat. The diagnosis, melancholy of the female sort. The treatment, silence. Here's a light-hearted, if grim, joke. Royal health check, 1 drop of blood, 2 cups of gossip, and a politically convenient conclusion. You pass now into a Russian palace's lower levels. A hidden room was once occupied by a Tsar's sister, who believed she was a bird. She refused to wear shoes, collected feathers, and tried to fly from the parapets twice. Her wings were confiscated, beautiful, handmade ones sewn from silks and parchment. Her name was quietly removed from the family tree. Then there's the tale of the Ottoman Sultan who trusted no one, not even his own reflections. Mirrors were banned from the palace. Any servant who brought one in was dismissed. His chambers were lined with soft drapes and no sharp corners. He claimed dreams told him who to execute. He was eventually removed by his own advisors. Historians still argue whether his behaviour was delusion or divine performance, a way of preserving absolute power through fear. You enter a smaller room now, almost monastic. A single window looks out over a walled garden. This was where Queen Maria of Portugal spent her final years, rarely speaking, weeping for hours. Some say she lost her mind after her son's death. Others say she was always delicate, and politics simply gave her no room to breathe. All around you, these stories echo a deeper truth. Mental illness was often treated not with care, but confinement. Royalty couldn't be seen as weak, so they were locked away, kept hidden. Sometimes medicated with mercury or leeches, other times treated with isolation, religious rituals, or nothing at all. And yet, some still ruled. Some wrote poetry. Some sang to the birds or spoke to the dead. Some fell apart quietly while others burned too brightly, dazzling their courts until the flame consumed them. You pause in a chamber filled with whispering, letters, diary pages, court records, and hear the repeated phrase, "She's not herself." And you wonder what herself meant to people who never let her speak in her own words. You step outside now into a moonlit courtyard. The stars above you look no different than they did to George III. to Cece, to Ludwig. And you think, perhaps their madness wasn't madness at all. Perhaps it was sorrow with nowhere to go, or imagination that didn't fit the crown, or rebellion disguised as delusion. Either way, it was hidden. Always hidden. And in those hidden corners, history shudders, trying not to remember. You trace your fingers along a painted wall that ripples faintly with age. Beneath layers of fresh plaster, there's a shadow, an outline of doorway long sealed. A servant once whispered it led to a private chamber where the prince slept. But not just one prince. 2 boys were born, minutes apart. Only one was raised in public. The other was hidden. Tonight, you step into a strange world of mirrors and masks, the shadowed realm of twins, imposters, and royal body doubles. The story's dizzying. The truth's even more so. It begins with a mainstream historical fact. In 1669, the man in the Iron Mask died in the Bastille. His identity remains one of France's most enduring mysteries. Some claim he was the twin brother of King Louis XIV, hidden away to prevent conflict over succession. Others believe he was a noble or advisor punished for knowing too much. Historians still argue whether the twin theory holds any water, or if it was simply a tale polished by novelists like Dumas, who gave the mystery its dramatic glow. But royal lookalikes weren't just the stuff of myth. You enter a dressing room filled with wigs, sashes, and face powder. A ledger on the table lists Mourning Rider, Ballroom Presence, and Shadow Walker, code names for the 3 men employed to mimic a particular Tsar's gait, posture, and profile at different times of day. A quirky tidbit. One double even had a slight limp added with a weighted shoe so he'd walk identically to the real sovereign during temporary injury. When questioned, he claimed, "It's an honour to limp for my emperor." You step into a hallway lined with mirrors, and the reflections multiply you until you lose track of which one is real. This is how it must have felt to be a royal with an identical sibling or a convincing decoy, never sure who was watching or if it was even really you they wanted to see. In a locked archive room, you find a collection of miniature portraits, 2 nearly identical faces labelled with different names. One is marked with a crown, the other with a single word, removed. A single word that could mean exile or elimination. You think back to Tsar Peter III, who was deposed and supposedly assassinated. But strange reports surfaced years later of a man claiming to be Peter, living quietly in a monastery. He bore the same scars, the same accent. Was he a fraud? Or had history locked the wrong man away? Historians still argue whether Peter's death was fabricated, staged by his wife Catherine the Great to secure her throne. You move now to Tudor England, where rumours once swirled about Elizabeth I being replaced by a male impostor after falling ill as a child. It sounds absurd, even laughable, but the village of Bisley clung to the legend. They claim the Queen refused to marry not out of preference, but out of necessity. The lack of medical examination in those days left just enough room for wild theories to bloom. The Virgin Queen, they said, maybe for reasons no one dared imagine aloud. You chuckle softly. Imagine the royal job interview. Do you resemble the king? And are you willing to possibly die for him? It's a joke, sure, but also not. Royal decoys were sometimes used as bait. If an assassin struck the wrong figure, the deception succeeded at a terrible cost. You pass into a chamber that served as a music room. A faint echo of harp strings lingers. On the wall, a painting of a young archduke who vanished during a journey to Vienna. His carriage overturned during a storm, but no body was ever found. Years later, a man appeared in Prague, claiming to be that same archduke, citing memories only family members could confirm. Some accepted him, others branded him a con artist. He died alone. His letters remain locked in a trunk. The seal, broken. The truth, still sealed. And then, there's the tale of the Danish princess who was rumoured to have fled the court and sent her identical cousin to wed in her place. Diaries from the time mention a sudden shift in her behaviour, preferences, even eye colour. Was it deception, or just growing up? A fringe tidbit whispers that the cousin eventually returned under a false identity and served as a lady-in-waiting for over a decade, watching her own shadow reign in her place. The question that rises again and again as you walk these halls is this: how do we even know who wore the crown? Paintings were altered as history is rewritten, even faces forgotten. How many rulers were replaced during times of war or chaos and never reclaimed their names? In a dusty glass cabinet, you find a wax mask used for royal funerals, a practice common in several courts to preserve the monarch's image in death. But the face is wrong. It bears features of a cousin, not the king. A mix-up, or a quiet substitution. You try not to wonder which body really lay in the coffin. You exit through a back hallway once used by musicians and performers. One actor's journal rests on a stool. It reads, "I played the king at a feast. My voice rang through the hall. No one noticed. Not even the queen." And that's the mystery of royal identity. When power depends on perception, sometimes the performance matters more than the person. If the people believe you're the ruler, perhaps you are. You look back once, as if expecting to see your own double watching you from the shadows. But the corridor is empty. A door creaks open to reveal a narrow passage choked with dust and cobwebs. You feel your breath catch slightly as you step inside, your fingers brushing the cool stone walls. The air is stale. No one has passed this way in centuries. And yet, something lingers. A trace of perfume. The imprint of footsteps long since faded. Someone walked in, but never walked back out. Tonight, you walk with the vanished royals. Princes and princesses, queens and claimants, who simply disappeared. Some into exile, some into silence, and some into the murkiest folds of history, where fact and fiction twist like ivy. A mainstream historical fact: the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were locked away in the Tower of London in 1483. They were never seen again. Their uncle, Richard III, declared them illegitimate and took the throne. Centuries later, two small skeletons were found buried beneath a stairwell. Many believe they belonged to the princes, but historians still argue whether Richard killed them, or if someone else did, or if, in a stranger twist, they survived under false identities. You now stand before the tower yourself, its stones cold and wet with London fog. The ravens circle above, their calls sharp and knowing. Inside, a narrow room with barred windows remains untouched. Two child-sized handprints press faintly into the dust of a windowsill. Or maybe that's your imagination. You blink, and they're gone. Next, you find yourself in the forest of Russia, walking toward a burned-out house in Yekaterinburg. In 1918, the Romanov family was executed there, or so the story goes. But for decades, rumours persisted that Anastasia, the youngest daughter, survived. A woman named Anna Anderson appeared in Europe, claiming to be her. Some believed her. Others called her a fraud. DNA tests later disputed her claim, but to this day, some insist the truth was buried alongside the empire. You pause beside a cracked mirror once used by the Romanovs. It's fractured into spiderwebs, as if trying to reflect too many versions of the same face. You lean closer. Just for a moment, you think you see her. A fringe tidbit. In 18th century Italy, an entire village claimed to have hosted a runaway queen from Spain, living under a new name as a weaver's widow. Her story was passed down through generations, complete with hand-stitched cloths bearing royal embroidery. Was it truth, or legend shaped by longing? Now you walk the long corridors of Versailles again, this time not in gold and candlelight, but in dust and silence. One of Louis XIV's granddaughters vanished on her way to a political marriage. Her carriage arrived. She didn't. Some say she fled with a lover. Others claim she was kidnapped by political enemies. A note surfaced a decade later in a convent ledger, written by a nun called Sœur Aimée, describing life before the silence. But no one ever proved it was her. You step into a library now, where books are chained to the walls, and the air smells of ink and old parchment. A volume is open to a chapter simply titled The Disappeared. Names fill the page, each with a story, a theory, a question mark. One royal vanished at sea, another during a masquerade, and one simply walked out into a snowstorm and never returned. You smile softly. Royal hide and seek, champion level, but beneath the humour there's something unsettling, because in each disappearance something more than a person was lost. A line of succession wavered, a war began, a love ended. You arrive in Portugal now, where King Sebastian died in battle in 1578, or so the records claimed, but the body was never found. For decades, Sebastianists believed he would return, a messianic figure to restore glory. Several men claimed to be him. All were disproved, but the myth persisted. Even now, in the quiet corners of Lisbon, old poems are recited under breath. He is not gone, only sleeping. Historians still argue whether the cult of Sebastian was a clever political tool or a genuine wave of grief that refused to settle. You open a chest in the corner of the room and find a child's shoe wrapped in royal linen tucked next to a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter begins, "If you're reading this, then I have failed." It isn't signed. You read it twice and place it gently back. Some stories don't want to be found. Now you walk through a hidden courtyard in Prague, where once a queen was believed to have faked her own death. The details are sketchy. Her coffin was suspiciously light, and a mourning veil covered the face. A maid swore the woman had escaped through a tunnel the night before. In a nearby village, a healer appeared the following year with a striking resemblance. She never spoke of her past. The line between escape and erasure was razor thin. A passing thought flickers. Maybe every palace had a secret exit plan. Tunnels? Disguises, silent allies. You could never be too careful when your bloodline made you a target. In a dark hallway in Berlin, you encounter a set of portraits, unfinished. The final canvas is just a silhouette. The subject never showed for the sitting. The artist's note reads, "She vanished before the second brushstroke." And you wonder, did she escape a cruel fate? Or was she taken before she could change it? The stories loop around themselves. One prince may have sailed to the Americas. A princess may have become a nun. A queen may have lived 20 years as someone's aunt in a cottage by the sea. You reach a window now, looking out over a courtyard of statues, all identical. No names. Just silent figures caught mid-step, as though frozen while fleeing. And maybe that's what these vanished royals became. Frozen not in time, but in theory. Legends made from gaps. Lives that twisted into questions. Not every throne was lost in battle. Some were simply left behind. A door swings open with surprising weight, revealing a dimly lit corridor where the tapestries hang heavy with age, and something else. You pause, noticing the woven images. A woman and her brother at a wedding altar. A king embracing his niece. A royal family tree with looping branches that curve back inward instead of outward. Tonight, you walk carefully through one of history's most uncomfortable paths, the silent scandal of royal incest. Hidden in bloodlines, justified by tradition, and often cloaked in sacred duty, this was a truth many monarchies embraced to preserve power, at a great cost. A mainstream historical fact, European royals, especially the Habsburgs, practiced generational intermarriage to preserve dynastic alliances and consolidate territory. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, his family tree was so tangled he had more great-grandparents who were also his direct ancestors. He suffered from severe physical and intellectual disabilities, including the inability to speak until age 4, and a jaw so misshapen he could not chew. Historians still argue whether his extreme health issues were solely due to inbreeding, or if compounded by environmental factors and poor medical care. You move deeper into the corridor and into a drawing room, once reserved for royal children. Toys lie still, wooden animals with missing ears, faded dolls with glass eyes. A portrait above the fireplace shows a young boy with a tilted head and unfocused gaze. The label beneath says only Don Pedro, age 5. A fringe tidbit. Some royal artists were instructed to idealise child portraits, smoothing out signs of deformity or weakness to maintain the illusion of perfection. But this one? It was never displayed publicly. It lived only in private galleries, like a buried truth no one dared confront. You now step into a grand ballroom where hundreds of candles once flickered. Under the golden arches, nobles waltzed and curtsied, unaware, or pretending not to be aware, that the bride and groom shared more than just a surname. You run your fingers along a guest list. Prince and cousin, archduchess and uncle, princess and brother. It reads less like a wedding and more like a family reunion gone. Complicated. You almost laugh. Royal dating pool, limited edition. But the reality was serious. These unions were often arranged with the belief that God had chosen royal blood, and so, keeping it pure became both political and divine justification. The result? Centuries of hidden affliction, quiet tragedy, and carefully scripted denials. In an Austrian sitting room, you come upon a letter, aged and brittle, folded between 2 pages of a medical ledger. It reads, "The child struggles to breathe. The midwife says his bones are soft, but he has his father's eyes, and his uncle's, everything else." It isn't signed, but the handwriting matches a queen's private tutor. A hush falls over the space. How many children were born not of love, not even of alliance, but of protocol, repeated too often and too closely? You find yourself now in the heart of the Ottoman harem, not the sensual chamber of pop culture fantasy, but a labyrinth of rooms where royal blood was managed, controlled, and sometimes diluted with intention. Unlike European courts, the Ottoman Empire occasionally avoided inbreeding by bringing in concubines from different backgrounds, often enslaved or foreign-born. This, ironically, preserved healthier lines of succession for a time. Still, court gossip often tried to link sultans romantically to their sisters or nieces, even when false, to undermine their legitimacy. Reputation was as fragile as blood. You step into a quiet chapel, where royal weddings were often staged with grandeur, but rarely love. On the altar, a gilded Bible lies open to a passage about Abraham and Sarah, family united. You sit in the pew and think about how often those verses were stretched to justify unions that left their children suffering behind palace doors. Some whisper that Egypt's pharaohs took it a step further. Sibling marriage wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated as divine. A godly bloodline mirrored on earth. Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers, though ruled alongside them in name only. Whether she had children with them remains debated. Historians still argue whether her alliances were ceremonial, strategic, or romantic. The line between them is razor-thin in royal history. In a corner cabinet, you find a collection of hand mirrors. One is cracked straight down the middle. A card beside it reads, "A gift from brother to bride. No name, just a date." And the implication? Another mirror hangs on the wall. Your reflection stares back at you, but it's altered, slightly blurred, as if your features have melted into someone else's. You blink. It's gone. Maybe the lighting. Or maybe this palace remembers. You move now to 19th century Bavaria. A prince known for his stunning features and poetic mind was the result of 3 generations of cousin marriages. He painted flowers with frightening detail and believed he could hear stars humming. At age 17 he was found wandering barefoot in the snow, whispering his mother's name into the trees. His medical report called it degenerative melancholy. He was locked away, but his poems remain tucked in museum basements, covered in dust. You step through the back of the room into a corridor lined with family trees, massive ones etched into the stone. You trace your finger along one line and realise it circles back. And again, like a snake eating its tail. A light joke forms. Royal ancestry, now with 200% more uncle. But it fades quickly, because you feel the weight of those circles, each one a child with the same name, the same fate, and the same silence. You stop in front of a stained glass window. It depicts Adam and Eve in a royal garden, not with a serpent, but with a mirror between them. Below it, a Latin inscription reads, "Purity of blood ensures purity of rule." You exhale slowly and wonder, at what cost? Outside the palace, the wind rustles leaves that sound like sighs. A candle flickers. You press your hand to the glass, and the chill seeps into your bones. The branches of royalty twisted tightly, too tightly, and the echoes are still untangling themselves. The wind carries you into a new wing of the palace, this one quieter, cooler, less ornate. The marble underfoot grows dull. The portraits along the wall wear simpler frames, and the scent in the air is something older than perfume, something like iron and stone and secrets no one dared record. You've entered the hidden hallways where royal justice was decided, and sometimes quietly avoided. Tonight you walk into the grey space between law and privilege, the secret trials, hidden prisons, and selective punishments of royalty. A mainstream historical fact. Royal families were rarely subject to the same justice systems as their subjects. Many monarchies operated under the principle that the king or queen was the law. They could pardon themselves, their family members, or quietly assign punishment outside the eyes of the public. The result was a legal world that operated behind silk curtains, where guilt was less about truth and more about convenience. You pass by a long oak table, carved with official seals and clawed feet. It's a place where secret councils once gathered, not to determine guilt, but to shape a story. There's a case file still left open, just a single page. A handwritten note. He must disappear. Create charges. Keep it quiet. No signature. Only a crest embossed into the corner, worn but unmistakably royal. In the far corner, a sword hangs on the wall. Its blade is pristine, but the handle is scorched. A fringe tidbit. One royal family reportedly kept a ceremonial executioner's sword locked away for centuries, used only in invisible trials, when someone highborn committed treason not worth a scandal. Their name would be removed from court records, portraits taken down, and the deed done under cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether these executions truly happened or were stories crafted to scare rebellious courtiers into submission. You open a small door behind a velvet curtain and descend into a vaulted chamber, part dungeon, part archive. Here lie scrolls labelled disgraced, exiled, and erased. One bears the name of a princess accused of poisoning her own sister. She was never publicly tried. Instead, she was sent to a monastery and never seen again. Her sister's death, officially recorded as fever, but a physician's note, hidden in the margin of a medical journal, reads, "Symptoms inconsistent with fever. Possible ingestion, advise silence. You pass into another room, this one even colder, lined with iron-barred windows. It once served as a secret holding chamber for noble prisoners. No chains, just locked doors and walls that didn't echo. A joke floats up. Royal jail, 5 stars, but you can't check out. And yet, the weight of what happened here lingers. One nobleman carved a tally of days into the stone, over 2,000 marks. His crime? A whispered affair with a widowed duchess tied too closely to the throne. Now you find a series of masks mounted on the wall. Carnival masks, expressionless. They were once used in anonymous tribunals, where judges rendered verdicts from behind disguises. In theory, it was to protect fairness. In truth, it allowed families to condemn their own blood without ever facing them. Imagine your cousin voting on your banishment while wearing a smiling porcelain mask. One is cracked. You touch the fracture, and your finger comes away with dust, and a chill travels straight to your shoulder blades. Now you're in a tower room that overlooks the hunting grounds. But this wasn't a place of leisure. It was a silent punishment. Royals who fell out of favour were often reassigned to remote estates under supervision. No official prison, just exile, dressed in velvet. A fringe tidbit. One Danish prince was caught practising Catholic rites in a Protestant court and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a country manor with only prayer books and a mute servant. He died surrounded by birds he taught to speak his name. You walk now through an arched hallway once used for night transfers. Royal prisoners moved under cover of darkness to prevent gossip. The floor is quieter here, made of padded stone. The lamps are low. You feel watched. And perhaps that's part of the punishment. Not every trial ended in exile or silence. Some ended in marriage, an odd twist of fate. A princess caught in scandal might be married off quickly to a distant noble. A prince accused of treason might find himself reformed by being sent to govern a troubled province, ironically turning punishment into power. A document framed on the wall reads, "Let the punishment be suitable, but not visible." That phrase echoes through your head like a bell struck in fog. You enter a chamber filled with mirrors facing away from one another. Nothing reflects. A court artist once stood here, tasked with painting the faces of the accused before their banishment, not to honour them, but to preserve their guilt. The eyes in each portrait look away, never meeting yours. One painting is unfinished, the outline of a young woman's face, her hair coiled in braids. No name, no date. Just a red slash across the bottom, where the royal crest would have gone. A modern thought flickers in. If Twitter existed back then, these people would have gone viral for about 5 minutes. But that's the tragedy. Today's scandals flash and fade. These were designed to vanish entirely. In a locked drawer, you find a medal awarded to a man posthumously exonerated for crimes he never committed. His family was ruined. His name restored only 2 generations later. Too late to matter. Historians still argue whether these hidden courts protected the monarchy or simply shielded it from accountability. But as you walk through the cold rooms, the silence feels less like protection and more like preservation. You reach a spiral stairway leading back to the upper floors. As you climb, you imagine the footsteps of those who came here not knowing if they'd return. Some did, some didn't, and their stories were folded neatly into history's darkest drawers. You step into a small, sun-drenched room at the edge of the palace, a place far removed from the cold corridors of hidden justice. And yet, a different kind of power lived here. Not swords or verdicts, but secrets in the form of ink. This was once a royal study, filled with the rustling hush of parchment and the quiet scratch of quills. And tonight, you're entering the world of forbidden letters and private diaries, the paper trail that history almost didn't keep. The scent of old books and sealing wax floats through the room. You run your hand along a writing desk still dusted with flecks of blue powder, once used to dry ink. A drawer creaks open, and you find a bundle of letters bound in silk ribbon, each marked only with a wax stamp. No names, just a royal crest faded by time. A mainstream historical fact. Marie Antoinette exchanged a long series of intimate letters with Swedish Count Axel von Fersen. Some were later censored, entire phrases blacked out by officials. Scholars still argue whether they were lovers, or if their closeness was emotional but never consummated. The redactions are almost poetic. I ache when you... blot. I long to see your... blot. What remains is a love story smudged by time and politics. You open one letter carefully and read, "This must never be spoken. Burn this page. But you are the only one who sees me." It's unsigned, but the handwriting, impeccable. Perhaps a queen's, perhaps not. Now a fringe tidbit. In Imperial China, concubines of the emperor were often forbidden from keeping written journals. Still, some did. Tiny scrolls were hidden in hair ornaments, slippers, or hollowed-out scroll rods. One such diary, written in a mix of poetry and coded metaphors, was discovered during palace renovations and is now housed secretly in an archive. Only a handful of scholars have ever seen it. You step toward a bookcase and tug gently on a leather-bound volume. It swings open, revealing a narrow chamber behind it. Inside, a writing desk facing a false wall. From here, someone could observe the hallway outside without being seen. This was no study. It was a listening post and a letter-writing sanctuary. One noblewoman got caught up in scandal, wrote daily to her sister in Vienna for years using invisible ink made from lemon juice. Her messages looked like blank paper until gently warmed by firelight, but one servant betrayed her secret. She was imprisoned for treason, not because of what she said, but who might have read it. In a cracked drawer, you find a small, heart-shaped locket. Inside, a piece of parchment, barely legible. It reads, "You kissed me after the ball." I said nothing, but the wind heard it. Just a girl's confession, or the beginning of a diplomatic disaster. Royal correspondence wasn't always about love. Sometimes it was survival. You hold a letter from a dethroned prince pleading for asylum. "They have burned my seal. I send this with the rider who has never failed me." The margin bears a note in different ink. "Rider failed." And your stomach twists a little. A joke passes through you. Royal pen pals, dangerous addition. But beneath the smile, the truth remains. Writing was power. Hidden words could start wars, end marriages, or shift entire dynasties. You pause now by a window. Outside, a garden sways in the breeze, and you remember that Catherine the Great wrote hundreds of letters, many to philosophers like Voltaire. In one, she joked about how ruling was harder than Enlightenment made it seem. And yet, her words crafted an empire that still bears her name. In a nearby drawer, a child's diary rests, its pages filled with awkward script and innocent observations. Mama cried again. Papa didn't eat. There's a new man at the gate. It reads like nothing, until you know that the family was deposed a week later. Some royal diaries were used as confessions. One Spanish queen wrote long entries addressed to God, filled with guilt and longing. When she died, her confessor burned most of them, but kept 6 pages in his robe. They were later discovered sewn into the lining after his death. Historians still argue about the ethics of these stolen words. Should we read what they never meant us to see, or does silence preserve their dignity? It's a debate wrapped in ink and conscience. You find a mirror now, its frame carved with vines. Written across the glass in faint silver script, the truth lies behind the letters. You try to see what that means, but the words fade before you can hold them. Another cabinet, more letters, some sealed with wax, others sliced open violently, as if someone wanted answers fast. One reads simply, "If they find this, I was never here." Even within families, letters were used as weapons. One empress discovered her son's plot against her through a misdelivered envelope. Instead of confronting him, she replied with a single line, I know, do you? He fled the court 2 days later. You run your fingers over a diary with a broken lock. Inside a single page, they call it madness. I call it remembering too much. And suddenly, all the letters seem heavier. Ink never forgets. It may fade, smear, burn, but somewhere, even if only in whisper, it remains. And as you step back into the corridor, you imagine the thousands of hands that once trembled while writing, the ones who hoped their words would never be read or desperately needed them to be. Whispers on parchment, truths in margins, secrets sealed not with silence, but with ink. The corridor narrows, and the marble underfoot gives way to dark wood polished to a near-glass shine. The lighting changes, no longer natural, but dim and golden, flickering with the soft pulse of candlelight. You follow the glow through a curved doorway and step into a room unlike the others. It's not grand or echoing, it's intimate. Low ceilings, thick drapes, velvet cushions, and the unmistakable scent of incense and crushed herbs. You've just entered the realm where seers, sorcerers, and astrologers once whispered into the ears of kings and queens. Tonight, you drift into the strange twilight where royal power met the occult, where visions shaped policy, dreams redirected armies, and cards foretold the future of empires. A mainstream historical fact. Queen Elizabeth of England famously consulted Dr. John Dee, a mathematician, astrologer, and mystic who used a crystal ball and obsidian mirror to communicate with angels. Dee wasn't a fringe eccentric. He was educated, respected, and deeply involved in Elizabeth's court. Historians still argue whether she truly believed in his supernatural advice or used his mystique to enhance her own divine image. You touch a blackened mirror now, resting in a display case, shaped like a hand, its surface rippled. Some say it's obsidian from Mexico, a gift from conquistadors. It was used to summon visions of future threats to the crown. It's warm under your fingers. Too warm? Now you move into a room ringed with tapestries, each one stitched with zodiac symbols, eclipses, and strange beasts. In the centre, a circular table with faded star charts, tiny ivory figurines, and a book left open to a page marked Nostradamus, Interpretations for 1607. You smile gently. Who needs a security council when you've got a guy in a robe and a telescope? A fringe tidbit. Catherine de Medici, Queen Consort of France, kept a team of astrologers in her household. She consulted them not only for state matters, but for the timing of her children's births and her own travels. One particularly ominous reading caused her to cancel a procession, and the exact bridge she was meant to cross collapsed the same day. Coincidence, or carefully remembered after the fact? You find a velvet pouch filled with runestones, each one etched with angular markings, worn smooth by centuries of fingers. Nearby is a scroll written in Latin and cipher. The wind brings omens, it begins, but only the wise can read its language. A chill wraps around your shoulders like a shawl. In a quieter corner of the room sits a shelf labelled Visions. Here, bound in leather and silk, are dream journals written by kings, queens, and even their attendants. One entry, written in trembling French, reads, "I saw the crown melt and the river overflow with fire. My son stood at the edge and would not turn back." The king who wrote this died of a stroke 2 days later, or so the records say. Historians still argue whether such visions were real, fabricated, or retrofitted to history. But their presence in courtly life was undeniable. Entire battles were delayed or rerouted due to bad omens. One Tsar refused to enter a cathedral for years after a pigeon landed on his shoulder. A sign, said his soothsayer, that death awaited beyond the altar. You now enter a narrower room. Hanging from the beams are strings of bells and crystals, swaying gently though the air is still. In the centre, a table set for tarot, cards laid out in a star pattern. You lean closer. The card facing you is the Tower, struck by lightning. Someone had a warning. One royal diary from the 18th century records a queen who awoke in tears from the same dream 3 nights in a row. The moon turned red, the crown fell into a well, and a child wept over an empty throne. A coup followed a month later. Another journal tells of a princess who believed her cat could speak prophetic truths. The court laughed, until she predicted a fire that destroyed an entire wing of the palace. The cat disappeared the next day. Some say she became a nun. Others say she followed the cat. The lines between mysticism and madness blur easily. You open a cabinet and find amulets once worn inside royal robes, small discs of iron, pouches of hair and bone, written prayers folded a dozen times. A note nearby explains protection charms for Coronation Day, worn close to the heart. A candle flickers low as you enter a final alcove. Here, the walls are covered in planetary diagrams, Jupiter in retrograde, eclipses calculated to the hour. A robe hangs from a peg, deep blue and lined with gold thread. A crown sits beside it, not of metal, but woven of herbs and dried flowers. Ritual wear, used only once a year, or once a lifetime. A small book sits open on a pedestal. Its pages are filled with names, dates, and predictions. Most are crossed out, but one is circled in red. A birth date, a death date, a comet sighting, a scribbled phrase, "He will rise, but not reign." The monarch in question was crowned and died 6 weeks later. You exhale slowly, the air thick with smoke and meaning. In the world of royal courts, the future wasn't just awaited, it was summoned, calculated, sometimes even faked. Some monarchs believed in it, others pretended to, for appearances, and some mocked it until their fates turned sharply, inexplicably. Another joke floats by. Your horoscope today, don't stage a coup under a waning moon. But even jesters knew when not to laugh. As you step back into the corridor, your shadow stretches longer than it should. Not all power came from armies. Sometimes it came from whispers in candlelight, from cards turned carefully, from stars read like maps of destiny. And somewhere, in a drawer you passed, a prophecy waits, still folded, still unread. The palace grows colder now, not from a draught, but from something more instinctual. A stillness in the walls, the kind that suggests footsteps once hurried through here but never returned the way they came. You find yourself in a narrower passage, lined not with art or mirrors, but plain wooden doors. Each one has a small bronze plate, etched with numbers. No names. Just silent anonymity. You've stepped into the corridor of royal deaths that were suspicious. Those that came too soon, too suddenly, or too neatly. The cases that left behind whispers, never proof, only shadows. A mainstream historical fact. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated by a revolutionary group who hurled bombs at his carriage. But his death also cleared the path for the far more autocratic reign of his son, Alexander III. And while the culprits were caught and executed, some historians still argue whether the palace guard's curious delay in reinforcing his route was truly a coincidence, or something orchestrated from within. You press your palm to one of the wooden doors. It creaks open to reveal a modest bedroom. Clean. Quiet. But on the floor, a faint mark where furniture was once dragged. There's no blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. The bed is still made. In the Habsburg Empire, Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph, was found dead at Meierling in 1889, alongside his young lover. Officially, it was a murder-suicide, but no autopsy was performed, no public inquiry. The details were vague, the bodies hastily buried. A fringe tidbit claims that Rudolf was killed for his liberal ideas, which clashed with the empire's conservatism. His death not only broke the line of succession, it set Austria on a slow, trembling course toward war. You move to a gilded cabinet holding a faded coronation portrait. The subject smiles softly, regally, but the artist later confessed that the sitter had wept during the session. She had seen something in a mirror that day, a pale rider, she said. 3 months later, she drowned in her bath. Officially an accident, but her closest lady-in-waiting left the palace that night and never returned. Her journal, found years later, contains one sentence over and over. It wasn't water. You glance upward. Even the ceiling feels like it's listening. Now you walk through a salon that once served as a game room. Cards still lie scattered across the table. A wine glass is tipped slightly. No dust, no age. Preserved. It was the last room visited by a French duke who died suddenly of heart failure at 34, hours after threatening to publish a memoir. His last words were recorded as "they won't dare." But the pages of the memoir were never found. One version of the story claims they were burned by a cousin. Another says they were quietly edited and released under a different name. Historians still argue whether his death was truly natural, or whether the wine in that very glass played a different role. You lean against a doorway and peer into a nursery. There's a rocking horse, frozen mid-sway, and a toy soldier resting on a velvet cushion. A prince died here of fever, but his nanny's private journal mentions blood in his mouth and a bruise at the base of his neck. She was dismissed the next morning. Her passage to another country paid in full by an unnamed benefactor. She never wrote another entry. You wander now to a chamber lit only by a single candle. In the centre sits a glass box holding a signet ring. The inscription is partially worn, but the emblem matches a short-lived monarch who ruled for just 12 days before collapsing at a banquet. Poison, some said. Stress, said the court. But one kitchen maid whispered to her sister about a bitter almond scent rising from the wine decanter. A joke curls in the air. Royal banquet tip, bring your own taster. But in some courts, even tasters were part of the plot. One particularly eerie case comes from the Ottoman court, where a young sultan died in his sleep, barely a month into his reign. The official record claimed night fever, yet the physician's notes, recovered from an estate sale centuries later, mention no fever, just quiet lungs, dry skin, and a peaceful expression. And here's where the pattern begins to settle in your bones. A royal dies unexpectedly. The explanation feels rushed. The attendants vanish or are replaced. The records become vague, and the successor rises, steady, smooth, unquestioned. In the middle of this hallway stands a table with 3 objects, a goblet, a letter opener, and a pearl comb, all beautiful, all implicated in royal deaths. The comb, a duchess reportedly pricked her scalp and collapsed hours later. Arsenic, it turned out, painted between the teeth. The goblet, its previous owner had a known enemy seated beside him at dinner. And the letter opener, found in the chamber of a regent who had ruled during the king's illness, only to step aside upon his death, gracefully, quietly, like someone who had played their part to the letter. You turn a corner and arrive at a series of portraits, all small, each lit by a candle from below. Their eyes seem unsure. These were the almost rulers. The ones who stood close to the crown but never sat on the throne. Most died of illness, falls, accidents. You read the causes, and the repetition begins to feel too convenient. One frame is empty. Beneath it, Lord Reginald, 1712, 1731. Intended, never crowned. No portrait was ever completed. His artist claimed the subject changed too quickly to paint. A curious phrase. One theory says he was mad. Another says he was made to look mad, then disappeared entirely. You step back, the air tightening. Here in the shadows, you begin to realise something simple and chilling. Power doesn't like surprises. And when inheritance becomes fragile, so do people. Not all royal deaths were planned. But some were just too perfect. The door you open now is heavier than it looks. Not gilded or carved, just solid, like it was made to keep things in, or out. As it groans on its hinges, you're met not with opulence or candlelight, but stone walls, shallow alcoves, and an eerie stillness broken only by your footsteps. You've crossed into the forgotten chambers of royal imprisonment, where crowns offered no protection, and guilt was sometimes optional. You walk forward, your breath echoing faintly against cold brick. And you realise, this place wasn't just for enemies, it was built for family. A mainstream historical fact. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent 19 years in various forms of captivity in England. Though she was a cousin to Queen Elizabeth I and a former queen herself, her claim to the English throne made her too dangerous to be free. Despite her noble status, she was kept under surveillance, her letters read, her servants filtered, and her movements confined. Eventually, she was executed. Historians still argue whether her imprisonment was lawful security or premeditated elimination. You trace your fingers along the wall, passing a faint inscription. M. Throrira. Her initials, perhaps, or someone else's. Royal prisoners weren't always granted stone carvings, but sometimes their names outlasted their cells. A narrow cot remains against the wall, its mattress thin, the quilt unravelling. One chain hangs from the corner, not necessarily used, but present, just in case. A fringe tidbit. At least 3 European monarchs were imprisoned by their own siblings in the 18th century, not for treason, but for being unfit to rule. One, a king, was declared mad after quoting Virgil too often at dinner. He spent the rest of his life in a palace wing converted into a private cell. You move through a hallway lit only by slits in the wall, high and narrow. These weren't meant for comfort. They were meant to remind. Royals who crossed invisible lines, political, romantic, or religious, found themselves quietly removed, wrapped in velvet exile or locked behind stone. Now you stand in a chamber with a broken chair, a writing desk, and a rusted bell. A note on the wall reads, "Ring once for food, twice for medicine, 3 times, and we shall see." It's unsigned. A joke flickers when your room service comes with threats. But the tension doesn't leave. You're in the room once used by Prince Gustav of Sweden, who spent 25 years imprisoned by his father for expressing support for parliamentary reforms. The public believed he had died abroad. Only after the king's death was Gustav's cell discovered, his beard long, his mind gone. A servant's diary noted, "He thinks the birds are ministers now." You step through a doorway padded with cloth, soundproofed, likely. Royal prisoners needed quiet, or perhaps their guards needed not to hear them. The room beyond contains a fireplace with no chimney, just a small, vented chamber designed to simulate warmth without a real flame. An illusion. A a comfort shaped from nothing. One queen spent 6 winters in this room. She wrote daily letters to her children, none of which were ever delivered. In the far corner sits a chessboard. Its pieces are mismatched. 2 queens, 1 missing king. A notation beside it reads, "Played alone, won twice." You try to imagine who wrote it. Then there's the case of the French princess imprisoned for refusing an arranged marriage. She was confined in a countryside abbey, where she became known as the Caged Swan. Local legends claimed she walked the cloisters barefoot every night, singing lullabies in 3 languages. A fringe account suggests she eventually escaped and fled to the Americas, where she opened a small school under a false name. No evidence proves this, but the school existed. Historians still argue whether royal imprisonments were justified, or simply a way to erase inconvenient people without shedding blood. You find a shelf of confiscated belongings, a comb, a quill, a hair ribbon, a book of psalms, dog-eared and weathered, a portrait with the eyes scratched out. You step into a larger cell barely larger than a pantry. A royal heir was kept here after speaking out against court spending. The walls were lined with sound-absorbing wool to prevent him from hearing anything from outside. He was allowed 1 visitor, a jester. The jester's job? To entertain, confuse, and report. The boy eventually stopped speaking. The bell in the hall rings once. No one comes. You pass a stairwell that leads upward into daylight, but the doors are bolted. The light is artificial, piped in through mirrors. In this place, even shadows lie. One final room. This one is different. It's warmer. The floor is carpeted. Books line the shelves. A harp rests in the corner. At first glance, it looks pleasant, like a retreat. But then you notice the doorknob is on the outside only. The windows are painted, and the only food comes through a rotating wall panel. A placard on the desk reads, "For her comfort, not for her freedom." You feel the floor beneath your feet harden. Some prisons look like paradise, and some were just that. Prisons built with silk walls and golden locks. Not all royal cells were made of stone. Some were made of obligation, of expectation, of silence. And in that silence, history kept its most obedient secrets. You leave the prison wing behind, its walls too heavy, its shadows too still, and follow a narrow hallway lined with closed shutters. The air here is warmer, thicker, scented faintly with roses that shouldn't still bloom. The hallway curves into a golden salon, and suddenly you're standing in a room full of royal mistresses, secret lovers, and forbidden passions, the affairs whispered behind fans, recorded in poetry, and woven into the bloodlines of empires. Tonight, the truth lingers not in public ceremonies, but in candlelit bedrooms and garden paths where eyes met and duty bent to desire. A mainstream historical fact. King Louis XIV of France kept a series of official mistresses known as maîtresses en titre. Most famously, Madame de Pompadour. She not only shared his bed, but influenced politics, patronised the arts, and held her own salon. Their physical affair ended early, but their emotional and political bond lasted decades. Historians still argue whether Pompadour's influence helped stabilise the court, or distracted it from deeper cracks forming beneath the monarchy. You walk past her portrait now, eyes playful, lips curled in quiet confidence. Her earrings sparkle, but it's her gaze that lingers. Not scandalous. Powerful. A fringe tidbit. Her rival, Madame du Barry, was chosen by Louis's courtiers more for her beauty than her mind. But she became a cultural icon in her own right. When the revolution came, she begged for her life on the scaffold, crying, "One more moment, monsieur, for pity's sake." Her life ended with the same drama she once danced through court with. You lean on a chaise lounge in the corner, the cushions velvet soft. A bundle of letters rests beneath a silk pillow, unmailed drafts to a lover whose name is scratched out in every line. You read one, You see me only in the corridor, but I dream of you in the garden. The air is thick with rose oil and old longing. You step now into a long gallery, its windows looking out on a moonlit hedge maze. Once, this was a favourite meeting place for a certain queen and her fencing instructor. Or so the rumours said. No records confirm it. But the hedge trimmed into a heart still grows outside the window, defying pruning. And then there's the story of a Spanish king who fell in love with his wife's lady-in-waiting. When the queen found out, she had the woman sent to a convent. The king visited the convent weekly, disguised as a pilgrim seeking counsel. He built a chapel nearby so he'd have an excuse to stay overnight. The affair lasted 10 years. The queen never spoke of it publicly, but banned white roses from the palace. It was the woman's favourite flower. In a side room sits a harpsichord. One key is chipped. Beneath it lies a scrap of music handwritten in ink that's nearly vanished. A love song with no name. Just the initials R with an M. You press the key. It sticks for a moment, then plays a low, trembling note. And you smile. Love songs don't need signatures. Now you walk into a dressing room filled with silks and gowns and velvet slippers. Royal mistresses were often dressed better than queens, and more watched. Every smile, every necklace, every tilt of the head was scrutinised. One mistress famously wore only diamonds after a rival called her common. Her portrait shows her wrapped in so many jewels. It looks like she's melting in starlight. You find a perfume bottle still half full. A label reads, Essence de minuit. Midnight essence. Perhaps meant to be worn only when the halls were quiet. One king, a young Bavarian, adored for his romantic ideals, fell deeply in love with an actor. They exchanged poems and letters written in theatrical cipher. When the court found out, the actor was banished. The king kept a single glove. It's still preserved in a museum, curled like a sleeping hand. Historians still argue whether love made rulers better or distracted them from duty. But in these rooms, you begin to feel the blurred lines between both. You stop before a fireplace. Inside, a pile of half-burned letters. One is legible enough to read. I would rather be your secret than someone else's queen. A joke passes like a breath. Royal Tinder. Swipe left on political alliances. But truly, the heart rarely respected treaties. In a tucked-away hallway, you find a room with no windows. Just a bed, a velvet curtain, and a single oil lamp. One English king was rumoured to keep a hidden room for his night visitors. Officials swore it didn't exist. But one visiting poet claimed to have stumbled into it and later wrote, "He greeted me with no crown, but all the weight of one. You run your hand across the curtain. It's warm from memory, not from light." And then there's the other side of this story. The secret children. You enter a gallery of miniature portraits, children with soft curls, deep eyes, and names like Valentin, Celeste, Julian, their titles. Companion to the Countess, Ward of the West Wing, Godson to His Majesty, phrases that meant ours, but not officially. One fringe account tells of a French child who looked too much like the king. He was educated, fed well, but forbidden to speak of his father. When the revolution came, he vanished. Decades later, a man in New Orleans claimed to be him. His eyes matched. His mannerisms were uncanny. But he died before anyone could prove a thing. You walk now into a chamber with 2 chairs and a mirror between them. The court used it to rehearse difficult conversations. Queens confronting mistresses. Lovers saying goodbye. You sit. Your reflection looks back. Tired, curious, maybe a little heartbroken. And somewhere behind you, the walls sigh with the weight of every secret kiss, every stolen hour, every goodbye that didn't quite take. Love had no title here. but it left fingerprints on every window. A breeze follows you now, soft and dry, like the breath of parchment. The walls grow taller, bookcases crowd in close, and before you know it, you're standing in the heart of a royal archive, not one made for historians, but for rewriting history itself. Here, beneath polished floors and wax seals, lie the quiet manipulations, false records, and official stories crafted not for truth, but for legacy. Tonight, you're surrounded by edited pasts, versions of events with carefully clipped edges, lost letters, revised portraits, and dates that don't quite line up. A mainstream historical fact: Napoleon Bonaparte commissioned a controlled publication of his life, overseeing how battles were described, enemies framed, and mistakes softened. The official French records portrayed him as a reformer and visionary, even while many European courts considered him a dangerous tyrant. Historians still argue whether his post-exile memoirs were honest reflections or masterpieces of political myth-making. You scan the room, scrolls stacked like firewood, shelves reaching the ceiling, each drawer labelled not by event, but by dynasty. Tudor, Habsburg, Bourbon, Romanov, each one a library of carefully selected memory. In one glass case, a royal birth certificate has been altered. Ink differences reveal that a name was added years later. A fringe tidbit claims the child was born of a mistress, not a queen, but retroactively adopted into the lineage to justify a later marriage. No scandal, only lineage strengthened by paperwork. You find a drawer marked discrepancies. Inside, a pair of gloves, a vial of red wax, and a book of family trees, 3 different versions. One name appears in 2. In the third, gone entirely. You smile gently. Genealogy, the royal version of creative writing. But there's something uneasy about the gaps. You find a portrait partially painted over, originally featuring 3 siblings, but one figure has been brushed into a background vase. Beneath the oil, faint outlines remain. A sister who died under strange circumstances. Some say illness, others something less kind. The final family portraits made her absence look natural. And that's the trick of history, not erasing someone, but never mentioning them again. You open a letter from an ambassador. It reads, "Your Majesty, as instructed, I have ensured the foreign press prints the edited speech, not the one delivered." A copy of both versions is attached. The difference? A single phrase. But one calls for war, the other for peace. Your stomach tightens slightly. One court scribe in Prussia kept 2 journals. One was for official archives. The other, hidden beneath floorboards, contained the real conversations, betrayals, and breakdowns. It was discovered only in the 20th century, full of footnotes correcting official entries. He didn't say that. She wept. The document was forged. Historians still argue how many royal truths were built on double bookshelves. Now you find yourself in front of a map, hand-painted, gloriously detailed. But in the bottom corner, a date has been scrubbed away. You lift the frame and find a second map beneath, marked with towns that no longer exist. Towns destroyed during royal disputes, their names erased, their people relocated under new banners. The newer maps simply forgot them. You wander into a room of bound speeches where kings and queens once declared intentions, regrets, and triumphs. Many were rewritten afterward to suit the political climate. One queen's wartime speech ended with a plea for peace, but the official version ends with a vow of vengeance. No recording remains, just the transcript that prevailed. A nearby table holds a collection of seals used to approve documents. One is labelled "Used only once." Next to it, a wax impression of a royal pardon, never published. The prisoner was executed anyway. The pardon was buried in the archive, sealed shut until unearthed centuries later by accident. In a locked drawer you find an unsigned diary. The opening line reads, "They will write what they need to. My truth must wait." The rest of the pages are coded. Some cracked. Some still mysteries. You pause beside a mirror framed in gilt. Scratched into the edge are the words, "The reflection lies too." Suddenly, you're reminded of a quiet scandal from Denmark. A prince accused of consorting with a foreign court was publicly exiled, but later documents revealed he'd been blackmailed by his own uncle, who feared his popularity. The trial notes were destroyed. A single page remains, its ink soaked through with wine, as if someone spilled their guilt across the story. A joke tries to surface. History, the original PR firm. But even the humour feels weary. In a chamber beyond, you find a wall of family trees embroidered onto fabric. 3 generations of names, places, and marriages, all framed in thread. But one panel has been ripped and stitched again. You lean closer. The original name, covered by a flower, delicate, permanent. Sometimes revision came not by ink, but by needle. A fringe account from 17th century Russia tells of a Tsarina who kept a private memory chamber. Inside were sketches, letters, and miniature figures of her family, arranged as she wished they had been. Her brother, banished in real life, stood beside her throne in this model. Her husband, cruel and cold in public, was smiling beside a toy bear. The room was sealed when she died. Some say it was burned. You step through a curtain into a final space, a scriptorium. Illuminated manuscripts line the walls. Most are religious. But in the centre rests a chronicle of royal reigns, revised across generations. Each new ruler scratched out certain names, added new dates, changed disaster to divine test. Each monarch wanted the last word. And that's the danger, isn't it? When you write history in ink, someone else may revise it in gold leaf. You look down now and notice that the floor is inscribed with names, not of monarchs, but of scribes. The ones who really wrote it all. The scriptorium fades behind you as you pass through a narrow arch carved with symbols you can't quite name. Half crown, half flame, half keyhole. The stone grows warmer, and the air shifts from dusty parchment to something spiced and electric. A golden light pulses from the end of the corridor, drawing you toward a chamber where power wasn't inherited or elected, but orchestrated behind closed doors. You've just stepped into the world of royal advisors, puppet masters, and shadow rulers, those who never wore crowns, but often shaped the hands that held them. Tonight, you're walking the soft carpeted halls of influence, the places where whispered counsel carried more weight than law. A mainstream historical fact, Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIV of France, effectively ruled the country for years. Though he never took the throne, his control over the military, finances, and diplomacy was nearly absolute. Historians still argue whether he saved France from chaos or created a state ruled more by fear than principle. You pass beneath a portrait of a woman dressed plainly, her face unreadable, but her eyes glint with something sharper than ambition. She was never officially titled, but her letters suggest kings turned to her for counsel more than to their own councils. A fringe tidbit. One English monarch trusted his childhood nursemaid more than his ministers. She had no formal education, but she knew the family's scandals, secrets, and weaknesses. From behind her embroidery hoop, she orchestrated alliances, soothed tempers, and whispered timely warnings. When she died, the king mourned for months. Her name was never printed in any court document. You turn into a gallery of masks, each one crafted to represent the roles played behind the scenes. The confessor, the diplomat, the favourite, the poisoner. The masks are worn, not theatrical, but utilitarian. You realise each represented a real figure at some royal court. People whose presence shifted history, even if their names never appeared on coin or banner. One mask bears the faint smell of rosewater and pipe smoke. You stop in a reading room filled with private correspondences. Here, advice is not grand or poetic, it's terse, sharp, and unmistakably firm. Deny the proposal, smile when you do, he will betray you within the year. Marry the cousin instead. One letter contains only this: burn the ledger before dawn. Power is rarely loud. Often, it looks like paper and ink. You find a ledger labelled Advisors Removed. It lists reasons like overstepped, unpopular, or the ominous knew too much. One name is circled, then crossed out, perhaps erased, or perhaps promoted quietly somewhere else. One court in Vienna had a rule: no advisor could speak to the king for more than 5 minutes unless summoned twice in a row. So one clever minister had a clock chime at the 2-minute mark to reset the ruler's attention span. A joke wanders in: PowerPoint presentations, but with powdered wigs. You pause now at a door labelled simply the Chamber of Influence. Inside, walls lined with letters, strategy maps, drafts of speeches. This was where royal words were shaped, debates rehearsed, gestures practiced. A small footnote in a Queen's diary reads, "He told me to lower my eyes when I say regret." It softens the blow. Not all advisors came willingly. Some were placed there by families, religious factions, even enemies. One princess wrote that her trusted lady often disappeared just before important decisions, returning with suspicious timing and whispered advice that always served a foreign court's interest. Historians still argue whether monarchs ruled or merely performed, reading lines handed to them by more strategic minds. You step into a chamber filled with puppets, not toys, but symbolic. Each carved in royal attire, with strings attached to labelled rods: church, banker, general, mistress, scribe. One rod has no label at all, but it pulls more strings than the others. A glass plaque beneath the display reads, "The crown sits lightly when the weight is shared, invisibly." In the centre of the next room sits a large chair, not a throne, but a minister's seat. The arms are grooved from nervous hands, the cushion flattened by generations of tense decision-making. A plaque notes, "More kings sat here than on thrones." You pass a cabinet filled with tokens, a pin given by an empress to her secretary, a coin engraved with an advisor's family motto, a vial of ink used to draft a treaty. Quiet objects, but powerful ones. Then you find something chilling, a diary, unsigned. The final page reads, "He does not know I decide what he signs. He thinks he rules, but it is better he never realises." You pause, suddenly aware of how many decisions, wars declared, alliances forged, enemies pardoned or destroyed, were not truly royal commands, but the carefully sculpted choices handed to them by someone else. And sometimes those advisors came with a smile and an agenda. You enter a candlelit room where portraits hang not of kings or queens, but of their most trusted aides. Most bear no names. Their titles are scratched into the frames: the Whisperer, the Steady Hand, the Gatekeeper, the Last Word. And at the far end of the room is a small mirror, simple, untarnished. A card beneath it reads, "The most powerful advisor is always the one the world never sees." You look into the mirror, and the chamber sighs around you, because every ruler needed help. And some gave more than advice. They gave direction, safety, betrayal, and silence. You leave the Chamber of Influence behind, its whispers still clinging to your collar, and step into a space unlike any you've seen tonight. The air here pulses with ceremony, yet it's muted. Too quiet for a coronation, too dark for celebration. Tall windows are shuttered, drapes drawn tight. Gilded mirrors have been turned to face the wall. You're in a room of royal funerals, secret burials, and the strange ways monarchs met the afterlife. Tonight, you move through velvet and shadow to discover what happens when crowns fall still and what must be hidden when they do. A mainstream historical fact. When King Charles II of England died in 1685, his body underwent an elaborate embalming process lasting nearly a week. His face was powdered, his hair arranged with care, and his corpse dressed as if still ruling. But rumours abounded about what really killed him. Mercury poisoning from treatments for syphilis? Kidney failure? Assassination? Historians still argue whether his death was natural or encouraged. You pass between two candelabras into a darkened chapel. Here, coffins once rested in state, shrouded with cloth woven with silver thread. Now, only the raised stone platform remains, and a single candle burns at its edge, its wax never quite reaching the floor. In the next chamber, there's a display of funeral regalia, a crown mounted on a cushion, black gloves, an ivory fan, each item carried by ceremonial mourners, none of whom were permitted to weep publicly. Mourning had rules. A fringe tidbit. Queen Victoria wore black every day for 40 years after Prince Albert's death, and kept his shaving water, his breakfast tray, and his clothing laid out daily, as if he were still alive. You step into a chamber of bells. Funeral bells once rung precisely 88 times for monarchs, one for each year of Queen Elizabeth's life. In another corner, a silver urn contains ashes from a torch used to light the pyres of royal servants, whose deaths followed their masters, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. Some tombs were public, grand, made to be seen, but not all. You descend now into a lower gallery, where the floor is made of glass. Beneath it, a path of sealed caskets lies like sleeping giants. Many are labelled, a few are not. Some bear only symbols, a crescent moon, a broken sword, a rose without thorns. The identities of these dead remain whispered legends. Lovers, children, enemies turned family. You find a scroll near one of the unlabelled coffins. It reads, "Bury without herald. Speak no name. Grieve quietly." It's dated in winter, but no year is listed. You pause in front of a carved wooden door. A sign above it reads, "Closed to the line." Inside is a room designed to look like a throne chamber, but reversed. The throne faces the wall, and the gallery is empty. This was where monarchs were mourned privately by those who couldn't be seen doing so publicly. One diary entry from a courtier simply says, "I wore my grief like silk, beautiful, smooth, and suffocating." You pass a cabinet of funeral masks. Not all were of the dead. Some were made for the living, courtiers required to wear stoic faces while attending royal wakes. The masks are blank, emotionless. A joke tickles at the edge of your mind, grieving, but make it fashion. And then you find the embalming records. Neatly written, meticulous, clinical. One king was found to have 3 ribs broken. The official cause, post-mortem swelling. Another was missing a toe, listed as pre-existing. But a handwritten note beside the entry reads, "No such condition known." Historians still argue whether these details were medical facts or quiet cover-ups for foul play. There's a mirror in this room too, but this one has been cracked straight through its centre. Beneath it is a single line. He saw himself dead before he died. The note is unsigned. A royal astrologer once predicted a king's death under a red moon. When the prediction neared, the court fell into chaos. That night, the king ordered the astrologer executed. But the execution never took place, because the king died the next morning. A tapestry nearby shows the moon in crimson thread. You enter a narrow hallway lit with lanterns the colour of dried marigolds. Here are the tools of burial rites, incense burners, marble coins, a comb wrapped in silk, sealed letters to the afterlife. One envelope reads, "For my mother." Burn unopened. The envelope is still sealed. You stop beside a grand glass case. Inside lies the crown of a queen who ruled briefly, then disappeared. No funeral, no procession, just silence. Her crown was recovered decades later in a monastery wall, wrapped in prayer cloth. The monk said a woman once came there, dressed plainly, bearing a jewel-studded box, and asked for sanctuary. She never gave her name. The box was buried in the chapel's foundation. Now you pass a wall of portraits, all posthumous, all imagined, painted from memory by those left behind. Some look serene, others haunted. One shows a monarch asleep with one eye slightly open. Beneath it, painted 3 days after her death, you notice something curious. Many portraits show subjects wearing red ribbons around their wrists, a symbol of protection in some cultures, or perhaps a secret code, a way to say, this one died too soon. A fringe tale tells of a king who faked his death to escape court life. He staged a dramatic passing, complete with weeping clergy and a wax body. He was buried, praised, and lived the rest of his days as a gardener in Sicily. Or so the story claims. The truth, lost beneath soil and silver. You return to the main hall where a book rests on a pedestal. Its title reads, "The Final Curtain." You open to the middle. A line reads, "In the end, the throne bears no weight. Only the memory remains. And even that can lie." You close the book. The candle beside it flickers. In royal life, the funeral is never just the end. It's the last performance. You move slowly now. The silence is gentler here, not ominous, but reverent, like walking through memory itself. Your footsteps fall on carpet so soft it feels like clouds, and the walls rise higher, lined not with stone but with embroidered panels. You've entered the gallery of forgotten royals, those erased by scandal, hidden by shame, or simply overshadowed. Tonight, you'll meet the ones history misfiled, siblings passed over, daughters buried in footnotes, and kings who never quite became a mainstream historical fact. Princess Charlotte of Wales, daughter of the future King George IV, was once the beloved heir to the British throne. Her sudden death in childbirth in 1817 shocked the nation and led directly to a royal baby race, pressuring her uncles to marry and produce an heir, which eventually brought Queen Victoria to power. Historians still argue whether Charlotte's overlooked legacy changed the course of British monarchy more in death than she ever could in life. You pass a portrait half lit, only the edges visible. Woman in royal garb, but her face unfinished. Not due to decay, simply never completed. An inscription reads, "She died before her likeness could be agreed upon." Some royals were erased intentionally. In a locked glass case lies the diary of a young duke who died at sea under mysterious circumstances. But his journal reveals his final voyage had no destination, just a note. They said the ocean would be gentler than the trial. The entry ends there. A fringe tidbit, in 17th century Spain, a princess with a disfigured hand was kept from public view for most of her life. She was educated, talented in music, and fluent in 6 languages, but never appeared in royal documents or portraits. A single miniature of her exists, hidden in a prayer book, her initials, F. I. Appear once in court records, misspelled. You pause now before a display of rings, royal signets without known owners. Each one once sealed letters, treaties, declarations. Their designs are distinct, but the hands that wore them, forgotten. In the next room, you see a family tree painted on silk. Dozens of branches stretch outward, blooming with gold ink. But 4 names are blotted out entirely. Not faded, removed. One blot has a faint shape beneath it, almost like Isabel? Irene? The light doesn't help. A joke whispers past. Even family trees get pruned for politics. One chamber contains only shoes, slippers, riding boots, bejewelled heels. Each pair belonged to a royal no longer mentioned in official records. A placard reads, "They walk the halls, but never the coronation path." You spot a pair of tiny silver baby shoes with initials L. V. A princess who died in infancy, yet court rumours claimed she was taken and raised elsewhere to protect her from a prophecy. The prophecy itself, lost in a fire, or so the archivists say. You drift through a room of letters never delivered. Each envelope sealed, addressed only to titles, not names, to Her Grace, to the boy who wouldn't obey, to my ghost. Some are love letters. Some apologies. One simply reads, "If I don't return, tell them I tried." The letter was dated 5 years after the supposed death of the sender. Historians still argue how many royals lived longer, or shorter, than the records claimed. Faked deaths, secret exiles, misplaced heirs, or just stories made to soothe uncomfortable truths. In a gilded frame you find a poem, unsigned. I wore the crown in shadow, my name behind a veil. My portrait's on the staircase, but painted with no tail. Beneath it, a worn cushion once used at a coronation rehearsal. For a queen who never ruled, her wedding was called off, her throne revoked, her name erased. One scroll nearby tells of a royal twin, born minutes after his brother, but deemed unnecessary. While one ruled, the other vanished from the records at age 12. A traveller's tale in India decades later spoke of a man who spoke English like a king, but begged like a monk. You step into a chamber draped in midnight blue fabric. Stars are embroidered across the ceiling. A circular bench rests at its centre. This is the Room of Wishes, a place where forgotten royals wrote what they hoped their legacy would be. You find a scroll tucked into the bench. It reads, "Let them know I danced once, freely, before the rules found me." Not all erasures were tragic. Some were chosen. A Polish duchess once refused to marry into a neighbouring empire. She vanished from court, and later emerged under a new name as a renowned healer in the countryside. She lived to 96, surrounded by herbs and children. Her portrait now hangs in a village school, titled only Auntie. You pause at a mirror that doesn't reflect. Or rather, it does, but only a blur. A small plaque reads, "History saw them this way." One final portrait hangs at the end of the gallery. A face half covered in lace. The figure stands in royal pose, hand on a book, crown just out of reach. The background is stormy. The nameplate is scratched. But you swear you've seen that expression before, in every story of a royal who almost was. Maybe it's not just a face. Maybe it's a mirror. You leave the gallery of forgotten royals with a strange weight in your chest, like you've been entrusted with memories that someone once tried to bury. The corridor ahead is dim, but the walls glitter faintly, as if inlaid with silver dust. You follow a soft curve and suddenly the space opens wide, and you're in a room that feels alive with contradictions. Grand and quiet, soft but sharp. You've entered the chamber of royal scandals, those tales of betrayal, theft, and deception that rocked thrones, and sometimes saved them. Tonight, you listen in on the court's juiciest whispers, the ones scribbled in the margins of letters and gasped over teacups just out of earshot. A mainstream historical fact. King Edward VIII of England abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. It was the first time in modern history that a reigning British monarch willingly gave up the crown for love, and it sent shockwaves through the nation. Historians still argue whether his decision was born of genuine love or a convenient exit from royal duties he found burdensome. A fringe tidbit? Some accounts suggest Edward had long harboured sympathies for fascist politics, and that his abdication wasn't merely romantic, but diplomatically necessary. A quiet removal, disguised as devotion. You walk past a display of royal seals, all snapped, broken, or tampered with. One is chipped where it was torn from a letter read in secret. Another has been melted and restamped, its original message lost forever. There's a desk in the centre of the room, drawers half open. Inside, forged signatures, love notes folded into court memos, and a treaty draft that includes a clause, written in invisible ink. A tiny vial of lemon juice rests beside it. You chuckle. Even royalty needed spy tricks. In the next alcove, you find portraits that were once slashed with knives, restored, but still showing scars. One queen accused of treasonous flirtations was removed from all official paintings for a decade. When she was reinstated, her likeness was made softer, sadder. They kept her crown but erased her smile. You pause in front of a locked chest labelled Scandals Quieted. The catalogue nearby lists jewels gifted and never returned, 2 cousins with identical handwriting, a priest who married a royal couple in secret, and one chilling entry, the twins who never should have met. A joke whispers from the walls. There's no drama like family drama, with castles. You enter a salon filled with chairs facing each other in pairs, mimicking the awkward tension of diplomatic meetings after rumours have spread. One chair bears a red stain, wine, likely, or something else. A note tied to the arm says, "He accused. She denied." No one asked again. You step into a room designed like a royal dressing chamber, closets half open, gowns of rival mistresses hung side by side. One corset is cut down the back, sabotaged. A fringe tale claims a lady-in-waiting stole her rival's perfume and mixed in a sleeping draught. The result? An unscheduled nap during a state dinner. She woke to find her role reassigned. Historians still argue how much petty sabotage shaped royal court decisions. In a side cabinet, you find a ledger labelled Unspoken Debts, names, sums, outcomes. One entry reads, "Loan forgiven after marriage." Another, "Silence purchased with property." In the next room, shadows play across the walls, projected silhouettes of conversations overheard through doors. "He knows. You promised. Not in public. Tell no one." The words repeat in loops, never quite resolving. At the centre of the room is a glass circle in the floor. Beneath it, an underground hallway, now sealed. A plaque nearby reads, "Tunnel to the servants' quarters. Sealed after the incident." The incident isn't described. You pass into a hallway where each door represents a closed investigation. On each, the cause, missing heirloom, unaccounted heir, unauthorised letter, broken engagement, confessed dream. That last one catches your breath. Confessed dream. What could be so scandalous about a dream? You open the door behind it and find a room lined with journals, all anonymous. One reads, "I dreamed I wore his crown, and he clapped." Another, "I dreamed she kissed me before the bells rang." These weren't mere fancies, they were written confessions. And in royal courts, imagination could be interpreted as intent. You step now into the last alcove, and here is a display of items quietly removed from history. A royal baby's shoe with no name, a coronation robe altered to hide a pregnancy, a sword never used in battle but recorded as blooded. You see a comb with initials that match no one, a love poem with 4 stanzas redacted, A letter from a cardinal, unsigned. Warning of sin wrapped in silk. You laugh quietly. Royal scandal bingo. Someone's probably got a full card, and yet, the deeper you breathe in this room, the more you realise something important. Scandal wasn't always shameful. Sometimes it was survival. Truth disguised as mistake. Desire resisting expectation. Humanity leaking through the script of royalty. You look up at a tapestry depicting a grand ball, but stitched along the edges are phrases. She danced with the wrong man. He drank from the wrong glass. She kissed the heir, not the king. They remembered it all, but swore they wouldn't. One last plaque reads, "A scandal forgotten is not a scandal forgiven." And so you exit quietly, Scandal's breath still warm on your neck. Even in velvet halls, the heart does not always bow. You step through a final velvet curtain, the kind that closes slowly, like the last act of a grand play. The air has changed. It's still warm, still hushed, but heavier now. Sacred, final. You've entered the heart of the royal memory, a place where oaths, curses, and final words were spoken, where monarchs passed not only from life to death, but from person to legend. Here, in this solemn chamber, the echoes are sharp and clear. You're walking the borderlands between reality and ritual, between what was said and what was meant. A mainstream historical fact. On her deathbed in 1603, Queen Elizabeth II of England reportedly refused to name a successor until her final moments, instead whispering, "I will have no rascal to succeed me." Her reluctance deepened the mystery of her legacy, and to this day, historians still argue whether she truly chose James VI of Scotland, or, if the decision was made for her. You stand beneath a great stained glass window depicting a throne turned to stone. Beneath it, an inscription reads, "All kings are statues eventually." A book lies open on a pedestal. Its pages contain the last written words of monarchs, some signed and others scribbled in haste. One says, "Burn the letter in the blue box." Another, "Tell my son not to trust the one with the ring." And another still, "I never wanted the crown. Not even once." You walk slowly through a room shaped like a circle. Along the walls are royal oaths, some made at coronations, others whispered to lovers, priests, or mirrors. One king vowed to protect his people, then invaded 2 of their provinces. One queen swore never to remarry, but kept the ring of her second love hidden in her sleeve until her death. A fringe tidbit. A 14th century Italian duchess was buried with a rolled parchment in her mouth. It was an oath of loyalty she'd never been allowed to speak aloud in life. It was discovered centuries later, intact, ink still legible. You pass a velvet case. Inside is a broken sword and a bloodless crown, 2 items placed in royal tombs when the rulers died without heirs. The gesture signalled the end of a line, and the beginning of power struggles. You feel a shiver now. The ghosts in this room aren't malicious. They're waiting, listening, making sure their words aren't misquoted. You step before a mirrored wall etched with phrases left by monarchs during moments of crisis. "I regret nothing. I regret everything." Was it worth the silence? One sentence is scratched deep, jagged and angry. They made me choose. Historians still argue how much agency royalty truly had. Were they sovereigns or pawns, masters or messengers? The answer, as always, shifts with the century. You find a hallway called the Whisper Walk. It's lined with quotes never said publicly, only discovered later in letters or court confessions. One prince reportedly told his valet, "If I vanish, check the fountain." He did. And they did. And they never found him. At the end of the hallway, a small door opens into the chamber of last looks. Here, you see paintings made after death, not of the body, but of how the royals wanted to be remembered. In one, a battle-worn general king cradles a dove. In another, a scandal-swept queen is surrounded by children she never had. These were the fantasies stitched into final memory. A joke flutters by. Legacy is just history wearing makeup. But you don't laugh. You enter one last chamber. It's small. Just a chair, a candle, a locked box labelled "Do not open until you've forgotten." A plaque beside it reads, "Here they said their final truths. Not for court, not for church, only for the quiet." One final scroll rests in the box beside the chair. You read it slowly, aloud. "I wore the crown. I bore the weight. I played the part. And now I unbutton the silence. The candle flickers. You sit down, and you begin to understand something most royals never got the chance to say. Their stories weren't always honest, but they were always theirs. Now, the halls behind you grow softer. The velvet fades into stillness. The footsteps of kings and queens slow into nothing more than memory. You've wandered long enough for the stories to settle, some loud, some quiet, some too strange to believe but too persistent to ignore. The candles are lower now. The mirrors have turned their faces away. Let the thrones be silent. Let the oaths be folded into dust. For tonight, their secrets are safe. With you, the air feels cooler, like the hush that comes before a gentle sleep. The kind where dreams tiptoe in, wrapped in silks, humming lullabies forgotten by time. You remember the garden paths, the masks, the unspoken letters, the twin who disappeared, the velvet-curtained scandal rooms. Each one, a thread in a crown too heavy to wear alone. But that crown is gone now, and all that's left is peace. So close your eyes, if they haven't already. Let the marble fade. Let the portraits blur. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the flicker of a torch at the end of a corridor no longer watched. You are safe. The story has closed its book. And as the royal echo fades one last time, you drift gently into sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.